staying with us. Now, how does white privilege look like in 2018? Does it still exist, perhaps? One can't help but raise these questions after a recent equality report by the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, the Commission report found that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. 64% of black South Africans and 41% of colored people are living in poverty. That's compared to 6% of the Indian population and just 1% of whites in the same category. Now with me I've got Terry Oakley-Smith from Diversi-T and Ernst Roets from AfriForum to discuss. Thank you so much for joining me on a Saturday morning. I hope that people have filled up on their coffee for this discussion. Now that report came out about a week ago and it really got a lot of people talking. Ernst, your thoughts on that report?
Well, I was disappointed by the report for a few reasons. The one was the fact that they repeatedly quoted ANC policy documents, which is of course a political party, in the document. And the other thing is, there's a few things, but I think one of the overarching problems for me was it's called implicit bias. It's when you make an argument without providing the evidence or the data, in the assumption that the data would prove you right. And the data is out and the data is proving them wrong. And what I'm referring to is what should be done to address inequality, or what can we do? And the assumption is that that which we have been trying to do, which has resulted in a worsening of the problem, must just be done more aggressively. And now somehow doing so there was a half-baked implementation of a proposed solution that resulted in a half-baked failure. Now we need to aggressively implement that, and there's no explanation how that would not lead to an aggressive failure.
Terry?
Well, not surprisingly, perhaps, I disagree with AfriForum. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to separate white privilege from the results of the Human Rights Commission report.
Indeed. Now, we're going to get there, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this report specifically first.
Well, I mean, I think the report is a shocking indictment on where we are in South Africa 24 years after democracy. I, as a white person, feel profoundly ashamed that only 1% of South Africans live in poverty, whereas more than 60% of black Africans live in poverty. I think if you also look at NEET, those people who are in education, employment or in training, the numbers are even worse. The vast majority of young black South Africans are unemployed. And even today, Marcel, it's easier for a white person to get a job, for a white person to be assumed to be competent, than for an African, a colored, and to some extent for an Indian. So I think our country is in a really bad position regarding inequality, political parties notwithstanding.
Now, Ernst, I hear what you're trying to say. You're saying that, and I think you were trying very hard not to use the term radical economic transformation, because you're saying that because certain programs from the ANC government has not worked, now they want to do more of what they have failed to actually do. But if we could just look at that specific, the numbers that were given to us, and even just looking at South African society, you have to admit that the vast majority of South Africa that is living in poverty is black, and the least amount of people living in poverty is white.
Yes, certainly.
And that speaks to white privilege, does it not?
No, it doesn't. How does
Why
it
not?
speak to white privilege? Well, I can tell you why it's not speaking to white privilege. There are a variety of reasons, and I think part of the problem is this idea of cultural relativism, which implies that if different people do things in different ways, the result will always be the same. And if the result is not the same, it's because the one has necessarily oppressed the other. It's not necessarily true in post-apartheid South Africa. So, for example, the fact that 1 in 3 black children, black babies who are born in South Africa, are born into families with without both of their parents, which has a significant impact on their chances of succeeding. The fact that 80% of schools in this country are dysfunctional, and it's mostly the schools in black areas. The fact that it has been found the reason why black schools are failing is not because white people are oppressing them, it's because black teachers are not showing up to teach. The fact that there's a big variety of problems in South Africa, but those aren't looked at because the problem and the reason why they aren't looked at is because these white privilege activists, it appears, I want to say the majority of them, but at least those who are most vocal, are driven more by their envy or perhaps even their hatred for the haves than their compassion for the have-nots. So when they see lines of inequality and they see white people have a lower level of unemployment. They are more angry about the fact that white people have more jobs than they are angry about the fact that black people have less jobs. And the question is, how do we solve that? The question that should be solved by fixing these things that I've mentioned. Instead of that, the proposed solution is we must have redistribution. That's not going to solve the problem.
But Ernst, what it sounds like is that you're saying that we just magically got to this place where we're sitting with these issues of inequality. You have to admit we have many generations of people living in poverty right now. Is that because we have generations whose lives were impacted by the fact that there was a system put in place so that a privileged race class could rise and rise and rise. And we're talking about apartheid there. And the genius of apartheid was the fact that they knew that it would reach its sell-by date. And once it did reach its sell-by date, that the generations of that white privileged class that followed would continue to reap the benefits of better education, of being to live wherever they wanted to, having better loans, being able to do whatever they wanted, and the vast majority of the country not being able to. You cannot say that generations of white South Africans that have come after apartheid came to an end did not benefit from the many benefits that their parents, their grandparents and their great-grandparents had from that system that was put in place.
Well, everywhere I've been in my life, I've been outperformed by black people. In primary school, in high school, at university.
Because they were finally given a fair chance and a fair opportunity.
Yes,
like
and they received proper education, which is something that the majority of black people in this country are not receiving. And it's not white people who are oppressing them. It's not white people who are the cause of the fact that black people, black children do not get textbooks. But there where it happens, there where the Department of Education actually do their job, or where they go to private schools or private universities or whatever, there it works. And yes, we can talk about apartheid, and we've been very vocal about our criticism on apartheid. And we should be, and we should continue to do so. But the assumption is somehow that if there wouldn't have been apartheid, again, this comes back to cultural relativism. If there wouldn't have been apartheid, that's the only explanation for black people living in poverty. As if apartheid never existed, black people would have all been rich and white, and there would have been perfect equality. There's no evidence that that would have been the case. Why am I saying this? Because there are many countries, or there are countries in the world that have never been colonized, that have never been oppressed by anyone, and those countries are the poorest countries in the world, poorer than black people in South Africa are today. So we must be it again comes back to the implicit bias. We can and we should attack and criticize apartheid, but we shouldn't have this implicit bias where we just assume certain things without having any evidence for this.
Terry?
So I think this is a very good example of mansplaining and whitesplaining that's going on here. I'm grateful that you're giving me an opportunity to say something. I think there's complete confusion between white privilege and inequality.
Indeed.
Inequality is the result of apartheid. And it's not that apartheid has in some magical way stopped to function in the same way. Black people are still as underprivileged as they were during those years. You've only got to travel into a rural area to see that.
They are less.
And it's not possible for the government we have, with the policies it has going on, to change that. And I think that it goes far beyond cultural relativism. White privilege is very simple. It's a set of unearned privileges that come to you simply because you're white.
Like what?
If I go to school, for example, if my children or grandchildren go to school, they're very likely to see characters in books that look like them. That doesn't happen for black children.
Ernst, would you give us a chance, please?
It is not blatantly false.
I went to school much more recently than you did. I looked. There were pictures of black children in the
They are few and far between. This is something that's currently being researched. It's something that's completely unearned, and Ernst makes the mistake, as many white defensive people do, of assuming it has to do with wealth. It doesn't. It has to do with those privileges we have that are unearned. I can tell you, Marcel, that if Ernst and a black person went in for an interview for a job, there would be an assumption, just looking at Ernst, that he is competent. He doesn't have to prove it. It's part of who he is.
That
comes with his whiteness.
Because it's more probable that a white
person would be more competent. And the black person that comes with him...
Ernst, would you give her a chance to speak? We had a long conversation.
Yes,
yeah, but I find it a bit offensive that I'm accused of mansplaining and
Can I just finish my sentence,
a little bit racist.
Marcel, can I just finish my
Terry.
sentence?
Yeah.
That, and the black person coming in has to work really hard, and more especially if she's a woman, to prove that competence. And that is what white privilege is about. It's what we haven't earned, but that somehow or other is part of who we are.
Now, the thing that shocked me the most of this report and various other reports, I remember listening to an interview that you did in radio last year, and it was about the South African labour force report that had come out that really showed that white men were still given preference in the workplace. And there are numbers to actually show that. Anecdotally, you just have to look at the Sunday papers when they announce who the new executives or promotions are.
I will tell you the numbers, Ernst. The latest Employment Equity Commission report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, shows that the top 3 levels of employment, top management, senior management and middle management, are still grossly overrepresented by white people and white men in particular. That's one of the things. Okay. That white men have more money spent on them for training, which I find absolutely extraordinary, than do people of other racial groups, and also for recruitment and advancement. So one can blame the Department of Labour and say they haven't done nearly enough to monitor employment equity, but the actual statistics that come out show very clearly that we are still in a very privileged position as white people, and especially as white men.
Ernst, would you disagree with that?
Yes, I do. Well, firstly, the point I was trying to make, that it is more probable that a white person would be more competent for a particular job because white people generally have better access to education. And I know you're smirking because you're thinking I'm trying to make a very racist statement.
Go ahead, explain
I'm not. The point that I've made earlier, that the majority of black people, black children in this country, go to schools where firstly they don't understand the language that is being taught to them when they go to grade 1. Secondly, it's schools that are not properly managed. I'm just quoting Stats South Africa. So that's firstly. Secondly, yes, it's true that on top management level there are more white people than black people.
And senior management, yes, and middle management.
Yes, which is, I think, less than 1% of the population of South Africa, so we need to look at the bigger picture. But what you are not proving is, why is this not the result of other things? Why is it exclusively the result of oppression? So a board sat together, for example, the board of whichever company, said, okay, we all agree we don't like black people, so how are we going to push the black people out, and how are we going to appoint white people?
No, it's not like that, Ernst. That's simplifying
it. Explain to me the oppression.
I will explain to you. When that person goes in for an interview, guess what the board looks like? The board are usually white and usually male. Only one woman sits on a board of a top 40 country in South Africa. So they mainly look like you and me. We feel more comfortable with people like you and me. It's more likely that we're going to decide to put somebody who we feel comfortable with in those positions. So it's not direct oppression, as you're suggesting, but it is because we feel more comfortable. And until we change those top levels, starting with boards and moving through top senior and middle management, we're not going to be able to develop all of the people in our country in an equal way that they should be developed.
And would you admit that there is a need for change and that it needs to happen faster than it currently is?
That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Because it's happening at a fast pace.
Yes.
But don't you believe we then have to first admit what the issues are before they can be addressed, and in a more aggressive way?
I'm admitting the problem, and I've been admitting it since the beginning of this interview. Every time I've spoken, the only thing that I've said...
But you first have to admit that this is the issue. The first step is admitting that there is a problem. And you're saying that white privilege is not an issue.
No, it's not, because it's not. It's the fact that 9 out of 10 black babies in this country are born in a house with both of their parents, as opposed to 1 in 3 black babies. Don't blame white people for that. The fact that black schools are dysfunctional because black teachers don't show up to teach.
So
don't blame white people
all
for that.
agree that the 20 years that we've had in democracy, the government has not done enough of what it's needed to do to redress those issues.
I would frame it differently.
But the issues, the vast majority of the issues that they've had to deal with over the plus 20 years has been as a result of oppression. And even though it doesn't have a name anymore and it's not in law, it doesn't mean that there aren't racial practices out there in terms of how we do business, how people are treated, and how fortunes are handed out.
Well, I would disagree. I would frame it differently. It's not that government hasn't done enough. Government has done too much. They've done too much in the wrong direction. That's the problem.
Okay.
The way, how are we going to address these issues? Firstly, it's very interesting. There was a recent study which said that looking at history, it's as if mankind or humankind still hasn't really figured out how to address inequality. Even the most communist socialist countries have not been able to solve the problem of inequality. I think what we can solve is poverty. And how do we solve that? How do we fix that? We fix that firstly by fixing the education system. Secondly, by empowering people, by making it possible for people or easier for people to start their own companies, to employ people. Those are the things that we should have been doing. But what government has been doing to now has been counterproductive. So there's such an aggressive regulation of the labor market that it's becoming harder and harder to start businesses. It's becoming more difficult to employ people. And those things are worsening the problem. So where government has intervened, it has worsened the problem instead of the other way around.
No, I mean, I think that, you know, government has tried in many ways, and in some ways have failed. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of the ANC. I'm actually in favor of far more radical economic transformation than is the ANC. But I think if you look at the kind of laws that have been put in place, like employment equity, like BBBEE, they have been put in place to try and provide a more equal playing field. The fact that many companies are very cynical about their implementation, the fact that many companies don't implement them at all or implement them maliciously, is not the fault of the laws themselves, but the people that actually implement them. There's just something about South Africa that somehow we're not moving forward. The news clip that we saw before we began about people still feeling okay to use the K word when they know that the kind of pain that can cause. The fact that only 18% of South Africans have any real friends of other races. I mean, how are we going to develop a country and develop equality in a country without making sterling efforts to educate each other about each other, to actually put aside our biases, as you say, and actually reach out to each other? It's not enough to just say 1 in 10 black children are born to single parents. I mean, many children are born to single parents who succeed very well. Yes. I don't think that can possibly be a reason why we have such gross inequality in South Africa. And I think it has to go back to the fact that we haven't done enough of what we should have been doing since apartheid. And that would be my contention.
Unfortunately, we need to leave that conversation there. I'm sure people will find you on those Twitter streets to continue the conversation. Terry Oakley-Smith from Diversi-T, Change Management Consultancy, and Ernst from AfriForum. Thank you so much for your time.